Welcome to Background Briefing. It was called an act of bioterrorism, the introduction of foxes into Tasmania more than a decade ago. Here's how it was reported on ABC Television's Catalyst program in 2002.
2 years ago, a group of environmental vandals committed an unthinkable crime. They hand-reared up to 19 fox cubs and released them into the previously fox-free Tasmanian wilderness. It's hard to comprehend that such a petty act has unleashed the greatest extinction threat since Tasmania's last ice age 10,000 years ago.
Bringing foxes to Tasmania is probably the most foolish and stupid thing I could think of being done.
I would call it an example of bioterrorism. We're dealing with something which is akin to September 11 for our wildlife in Australia.
In response, the Tasmanian government started a decade-long multi-million-dollar search and destroy program that's still going today, but has never found a live fox. It's been the subject of furious public debate and media speculation in Tasmania. Now, an independent scientific review is saying the Tasmanian fox story is a myth. Leading that review is Dr. Clive Marks. He helped set up the state's fox eradication program. He now believes Tasmanians have been misled.
Here's an example where you can propose that something exists when it doesn't, and if you follow that narrative with a suitable amount of media and spin doctoring, you can get a good proportion of people believing it.
The story was that hunters released foxes across Tasmania around the year 2000. The director of the Tasmanian Conservation Trust, Peter McGlone, is on a government fox advisory committee, and he firmly believes that release did happen.
The investigation into the deliberate introduction of foxes that did take place, I'm confident took place, was bungled.
How was it bungled?
It was bungled by the minister refusing to accept advice that to successfully prosecute those people who were known by authorities to have done this, they would have had to have retrospectively changed legislation. But it was the advice of the experts at the time that we have these people absolutely dead in the water. They are guilty as sin.
But police reports from 2001, obtained under Freedom of Information, show there was no evidence to charge anyone, retrospectively or not. The police dismissed the allegations as hearsay, gossip and rumour. Despite that, Tasmanians have been told for years that the foxes really were released. The police minister at the time was David Llewellyn, who was also the minister in charge of Parks and Wildlife. David Llewellyn's now an opposition MP.
Senior people within the Department of Parks and Wildlife gave me that advice, and they were absolutely certain of the fact. Although it was somewhat dated, by the time it got to me, I initiated a police investigation, which I'm not sure how thoroughly it was done, but there wasn't enough evidence to follow up from a legal point of view.
Did you see the police report when it was done, the report that said that the information that came from Parks and Wildlife was rumour and probably guesswork, and some of it was highly suspect?
Well, I can't recall the details of that right now, but it was, somewhat after the event.
But the original police report really dismissed all that evidence. Are you confident that Parks and Wildlife had enough information to go on to establish that foxes were in the state?
Well, absolutely. I mean, at the time, it was quite a serious issue, and I took the advice that I was given quite seriously.
For the first time, one of the hunters accused of importing those foxes is speaking publicly.
No one's brought any... I have not brought any foxes into the state.
Adrian Donaldson lives in the state's north, and his name appeared on a confidential briefing note that was handed to the police minister back in 2001.
It's kind of a shock to even have you here speaking to me about the whole thing when it's just all made up.
We'll hear more from Adrian Donaldson later. A police task force interviewed the three hunters back in 2001. The commander of that police task force at the time was Ivan Dean.
Yes, they were spoken to, and nothing came from that at all. Their evidence was plausible in all of the circumstances, and I then reported back to the Commissioner saying there was just no truth in it whatsoever. From our point of view, we could find no evidence at all. and it was a thorough investigation. Well done. Some of the top detectives in this state at the time, they were on this investigation, so it wasn't something we treated lightly. We treated it as an extremely serious matter.
Ivan Dean is now a politician in the Tasmanian upper house, and he's a strong critic of the decade-long fox eradication program.
There's been in the realms of about $50 million spent on this program, and when you look at the whole of the evidence on which this was built, it falls away to absolutely nothing. And in my opinion, it has been $50 million wasted.
The fox eradication program, in its various forms, is administered by Tasmania's Department of Primary Industries, Parks, Water and the Environment, and the department has declined to comment. A former spokesman for the program, though, is biologist Nick Mooney, who left the department several years ago and is now a wildlife consultant.
We were confident the evidence showed that there was a high enough risk that something substantial had to be done. The simple fact is, if you wait long enough that everyone's happy there are foxes in Tasmania or satisfied there are foxes in Tasmania, it's too late to do anything, because there will have to be so many there that people start shooting them, and we start shooting them, or the police shoot one, or whatever, and it'll be too late to do anything. That's the problem.
Another problem, though, is that the eradication program has been running for more than a decade, and it has not shot, photographed or trapped a live fox or found evidence of a baited fox. A team of 7 scientists has been reviewing the program, and it's just published its report online. There's a link on the Background Briefing website. Veterinary pathologist Dr. David Obendorf is one of the authors.
The difficulty this program had was that it used a great deal of propaganda and public relations to get across its message, but it failed to actually pass the first test, which was the onus of proof test. People need to know that this has been independently, repeatedly demonstrated, that you have got evidence that shows that the fox is in the landscape. So what we've got is a situation where the threat has always been a real threat for Tasmania, but the presence of evidence is completely zero.
After more than 10 years, Tasmanians have become deeply sceptical about the foxes they've been told are in their midst. I'm driving north from Hobart to what's considered Fox Central, the town of Longford, where 3 hunters were said to have brought in, raised and then released fox cubs. Longford's off the main road, down a country lane lined with hedges. The countryside looks European. There are sheep and chickens in the paddocks. A fox wouldn't look out of place here. In the centre of Longford village is the Blenheim Inn Hotel.
Foxes? What do you want to know about them? I've got a shitload on my phone. We'll let them out every now and then. You see that fox? You got to try your place. Fox? You got
It's a Friday evening and people are coming in after work.
Well, I hear a lot of people talking. They do a lot of shooting. There's no foxes about.
Nobody ever seen a fox?
No.
Any of you guys?
No, mate, I don't reckon there is. I've been shooting a fair bit myself, but I've never seen one. There's a fox about. He's hanging out with that Tasmanian tiger, old mate.
Is it a bit of a joke around here? The fox has become a joke?
Yes, yeah. Yeah, I'm sure it is. If there's scats around or whatever, look, anyone could have brought them in from the other side or something or other. Look, surely they should have found them by now.
It was to Longford that the police task force came in 2001 to investigate a report that hunters had raised up to 19 foxes on a farm out of town and then released them around the island to improve the hunting. According to the police reports, it all started with a conversation at the back of a vehicle outside the All Goods store in the Hobart suburb of Glenorchy. An unnamed man was heard to say that hunters had brought fox cubs in from Victoria. The person who reported it said he thought at the time it was a joke, but on reflection told Parks and Wildlife officers. By the time the story reached the Minister for Police, David Llewellyn, it had been put into a briefing note that contained names, places and times. The briefing note was passed to police and 5 detectives were put onto the case. When they reported back in July 2001, they were scathing about what was in that briefing note. Here's a reading from the police report.
On investigation, it became abundantly clear that the original informant spoken to by police had only passed on part of that information, most of which was hearsay and gossip. The remaining information seems to have come from Parks and Wildlife Service personnel, who've relied on rumour and probably guesswork. None of the information was confirmed, and some was found to be highly suspect.
You'd think it might have ended there, but that was just the beginning. The police commander at the time, Ivan Dean, said that police report was handed to the police minister.
The Minister of Police at the time accepted that report. However, the minister later went back on some of that information and after, I guess, following briefings from other sides.
The police minister was David Llewellyn, who is also the minister in charge of Parks and Wildlife. He's now an opposition MP. David Llewellyn says senior people within Parks and Wildlife persuaded him, in spite of the police report, that the event did happen. He says he's still convinced of it.
Well, yes, I am. I mean, I think it was very seriously taken at the time, and people involved, were quite, as I say, senior people within the department, and for not following the matter up, I think, that would have been a tragedy if we had have seen the incursion sort of develop into larger numbers of foxes in the state.
That campaign kicked off, though, on the basis of those foxes being released, and it's since transpired that there was no evidence for that. The police reports...
Well, you were saying that. I don't believe that. I think there's a lot of evidence, and I think that's authenticated by the scat evidence that's been seen since, and certainly the very high number of people that have reported sightings of foxes in the state.
When the fox eradication campaign kicked off 12 years ago, one of the first people brought in was Dr. Clive Marks, who we heard at the start of the program describing the introduction of foxes as the September 11 for Tasmanian wildlife. Clive Marks is one of Australia's foremost fox experts, and at the time worked for the Victorian government.
It was initially indicated to me that the police had confirmed the release of these animals, and that was without a doubt, but because it was sub judice, the details could not be provided. Now, given that was the story I received from at least 2 Tasmanian government employees at the time, I had no reason to doubt it.
One of those Tasmanian government employees was Wildlife Officer Nick Mooney. Here's Nick Mooney talking to Robin Williams on the ABC's Science Show back in 2002.
Our information is that they were basically smuggled in by vehicle on a ship.
And so presumably they were brought to shore and let free somewhere in the north of Tasmania?
Yes, because this is all done in secrecy and it's very illegal. It's very hard to get a handle on what actually happened, and so of course our information is hearsay, and we can only have a certain amount of faith in it.
But today that faith has trickled away. Nick Mooney's on the phone from his home at Richmond in Tasmania. Do you believe that actually happened?
I don't know. To me, it's a story. It might be a very credible story when told by some people, but I don't have a strong view of it because I've seen no evidence.
But back in 2002, the respected journal Nature ran a story quoting Nick Mooney as saying, "The information that authorities have received leaves no doubt that foxes were deliberately brought into Tasmania." It was such a serious claim that fox expert Clive Marks flew to Tasmania to help organise a national response.
I had no reason to doubt that. So, of course, I worked on the basis anyway of the precautionary principle, which is something that's sensible to do to begin with. And we started to organise a response. So, yes, I had no reason at all to doubt the veracity of the claims.
Clive Marks says the precautionary principle was only triggered back then because authorities had assured him the foxes had been introduced. He went to Canberra to help organise funding and then returned to his main job with the Victorian government. It wasn't until 7 years later when he was sent a copy of that original police report scotching the fox release story that Clive Marks decided to take a closer look at all the other claims being made about foxes in Tasmania.
And I was staggered by what I found. The thinking about this in sort of wider political terms is quite frightening, because you come up with a completely different interpretation about what's going on.
North of Longford, on the road to Devonport, is the quiet village of Westbury. It's here that I've found Adrian Donaldson, one of the 3 hunters named as suspects in the alleged fox importation caper and questioned by police. This is the first time that Adrian Donaldson has spoken publicly, and he says he's shocked anyone still believes that story.
I just believe it's bloody, it's all a myth. It is really a myth. I don't believe there's any foxes in the state.
The accusation originally was that you and a couple of other blokes had brought in fox cubs. Did the police ever talk to you about that?
I didn't even understand it back then. It was like, you got to be joking. That's absolute bull dust.
That initial accusation that people brought in fox cubs still has some credibility.
To whom? To whom? Because for me, I don't spend any time looking for foxes. I am a hunter, but there's no foxes in the state. There's a lot of hunters in the state and they don't see them. So the people you must be talking about must be the Fox Task Force. They're the ones who see foxes, nobody else.
Actually, the Fox Task Force, later called the Fox Eradication Program, has never seen a live fox in Tasmania either. What the Fox Program has produced are 4 already dead foxes and a skull provided by the public, a DNA sample found in a chicken coop, and 2 sets of paw prints. These all have detailed stories behind them, and on the Background Briefing website there's a link to what the Fox Eradication Program says about them, as well as a link to what the new scientific review is disputing. The only fox event that people agree happened was in 1998, when a lone fox walked off a boat at Burnie. It escaped, but being outside the fox breeding season, it was unlikely to have bred or even lived long. Foxes live only 3 to 5 years in the wild. It made news, though, and was followed by a rash of sightings. The Fox Eradication Program, now part of the Tasmanian Government's Invasive Species Unit, still receives and investigates fox sightings and rates them for quality from poor to excellent. The sightings, thousands since 1998, have convinced many people that foxes must be in Tasmania. Peter McGlone from the Tasmanian Conservation Trust says there have been so many sightings they can't all be wrong.
In the case of 2 carcasses that have been found, you could imagine, well, maybe that was, that we haven't found any more carcasses since maybe that was false evidence. With the sightings, there's a ranking that's placed on all sightings based on a whole lot of criteria about whether it was good at daylight, how long you saw it, how far you were from it, what characteristics you could describe without being prompted. All these things are done, and there's scores and scores of very high quality sightings over the last decade or so, including people that I've met who I totally trust as being not just good at observation but very unbiased.
But sightings are notoriously unreliable. The new scientific review of the Fox Program, led by Clive Marks, has looked at the sightings and found they peak after media reports.
When a claim of physical evidence of a fox being identified was advertised in the media, we saw a spike or a cluster in sightings around that particular event. So there were 2 things that drove the sightings, the anecdotal reports, the amount of media, and then the claim that there was convincing evidence of a fox based upon so-called physical evidence. Now, the other interesting factor was, of course, the decline in fox sightings that was mistaken to be indicative of the efficacy of baiting was only really a decline in media intensity. Annually, the media intensity as it built until 2009, 2010, so did fox sightings.
2006 was a big year for foxes in the media, and sightings soared. The Fox Program's initial funding was coming to an end, and the Invasive Animals Cooperative Research Centre in Canberra published a review of the program and concluded that foxes were still running wild across Tasmania. This was one of the television news items at the time.
It's time for Tasmanians to get serious about fox eradication. That's the message from a team of experts whose new report has found overwhelming evidence of foxes in the state. They say it's time to stop doubting the veracity of recent sightings and get on with wiping them out.
There have been more than 1,000 fox sightings in Tasmania over the past 8 years, but many have been dismissed as hoaxes. A Canberra-based research team has spent 12 months reviewing the state's fox program and says there's no doubt the animals are here.
Here endeth part 1 of foxes in Tasmania.